famous ziggurat of Ur, which is known as Ur of the Chaldees in the Bible. And this structure has been renovated many times, including most recently by Saddam Hussein. But this structure is about 4,100 years old. It's not the oldest thing in Sumer. Eridu and other Sumerian cities, Uruk, Lagash, are a bit older than that. Background, which archaeologists have traced, but this big structure, about just over 4,000 or so years old. You can see that it's a mud brick structure. It's very nicely done. They have beautiful tile floors, very extensive brickwork. Obviously, this was an evolved civilization at that point. And interestingly, Sumer has a myth of the flood. In fact, it's a fundamental myth to understanding ancient Sumer. It's in an epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh, the tablets of which have survived. And it's interesting when you look at the Ice Age, what happened in the Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf, which is that that's how it looks today. But during the Ice Age, there was a gigantic river system ran through the Persian Gulf, the combined streams of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and it was a green and pleasant valley, very suddenly flooded sometime after about 12,000 years ago. So the Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of effectively the Sumerian Noah, Utnapishtim, who is warned by a god of the coming cataclysm and advised to put men and women and all the seeds that will be necessary to grow plants in the future into an ark and species of different animals. It's the progenitor of the Noah story in the Bible. And there's this other character called Oannes, who interestingly wears a fish on his head. These figures are found all over Babylonian and Sumerian iconography. The fish-garbed figure. Oannes was said to be a civilizer who emerged from the waters of the flood after the flood and taught mankind all the skills necessary to restart civilization. Not to start it for the first time, but to start it again. And he is depicted as a creature. It's part fish, part man, but I think the symbolism is very clear. He was able to survive the flood. If we go to magnificent Egypt and the amazing pyramids of Giza, and by the way, of course, almost all the photographs tonight are taken by my wife, Santa. She and I have been on the road together for 22 years on top of the Great Pyramid, underwater everywhere. I mean, we've shared every adventure, and I hope we will continue to do so, even if I am sometimes extremely annoying. So there's, magnificent Giza Plateau. And there's the Temple of Horus at Edfu. Which is a much later temple. Many Egyptologists will tell you that there is no Atlantis story in Egypt. There is no flood story in Egypt. They repeat this like a mantra. And they use it in part to discredit Plato, because Plato said he got the story of Atlantis from his ancestor Solon, who in turn got it from the Egyptians. And the archaeologists say, but how can that be when there is no Egyptian flood story? But that's absolute balderdash, because there is a huge Egyptian flood story, and it's written in plain view on the walls of this temple. They're called the Edfu building texts, and the background of the Edfu building text is really interesting, because they tell us that there was an ancient document, a document that was so old that it was falling apart, a document that was said to have come down from the time of the gods, and that this document, in order to preserve it, in Ptolemaic times they constructed this temple and they carved the texts into its walls, and that's why they're called the Edfu building texts, and they tell of the homeland of the primeval ones, which was on an island and which was destroyed in a great flood. And there were survivors, and some of them came to Egypt, and they established religion in Egypt, and they established the sites where all future temples and pyramids would be built. So what these texts are telling us is not only that there was a flood, not only that Egypt was founded by flood survivors, but also every temple and pyramid that you see, even though it may date from a later period, has been placed on a site that belongs to a much earlier time, and that was selected in a much earlier time. So there's Plato, and this resonant phrase that the destruction of Atlantis in a single terrible day and night, and that the destruction was so severe that mankind had to begin again like children, with no memory of what went before. And Plato tells us that he got that information from Solon. Solon dates from 600 BC, and Solon got it from the priests of Sais in the Delta in Egypt. So that means that when those priests told Solon that the flood happened, that destroyed Atlantis, happened 9,000 years before that time, they're telling us it happened in 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. And as it happens, again, Plato has been accused of all sorts of things, but it's really weird because 9,600 BC is actually an incredibly important date. It is a date that marks exactly what is called the end of the Younger Dryas, 11,600 years ago, 9,600 BC. So, I spoke of the Ice Age and how it reached the last glacial maximum 21,300 years ago. Following that, there was a substantial warming. 16,000, 15,000, 14,000 years ago, the Earth was warming up. It seemed to be coming out of the Ice Age. Sea levels were rising, and the whole planet was becoming a more comfortable place to be. And then suddenly, 12,890 years ago, and we can be very precise because of the Greenland ice cores, 12,890 years ago, give or take 5 years, a dramatic instantaneous deep freeze set in, and the world plunged back into extreme ice age conditions. And there was a radical reglaciation. And that was the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a very mysterious period. It's called the Younger Dryas because Dryas is a particular kind of flower species that survives or doesn't survive in certain climates. And it lasted from 12,980 years ago until 11,600 years ago. And then the Earth started to warm up again. Everything that we know about the story of human civilization, it's really interesting, it all unfolds in that period, after the end of the Younger Dryas, after 11,600 years ago. And for me, the Younger Dryas is like a huge punctuation mark, which caused radical changes on the Earth, and that we have to consider the possibility of what happened before the Younger Dryas. But the Younger Dryas may have been the event that made us a species with amnesia and wiped out our memory of our past. Now, of course, the Atlantic is very much in the Atlantic Ocean, and that's Athanasius Kircher's map of Atlantis. In those days, south was put on the upper part of a map, but we would like to turn this map around to see it in the way we normally do with Spain and North Africa here, and the Americas here, and there's Atlantis in the middle. Focuses on the Atlantic, but actually this is a global story. I would like to consider that story and elements of that story in India, where we are right now, and where up here in this area existed the Indus Valley civilization, a civilization that coexisted with Egypt and Sumer, and was of at least equal scale, and was a very advanced civilization. And this place is one of the ports of that civilization. It's called Lopal, and it's not beautiful to look upon, but this is what remains of a huge dock that was built at Lopal. This was a seafaring civilization more than 5,000 years ago. And here is Mohenjo-Daro, now in modern Pakistan. A very difficult place to get to. Santa and I had to have an armed escort to get to Mohenjo-Daro. And this is the great bath of Mohenjo-Daro. And here you can see the bitumen between the bricks where they waterproofed it. It was a very advanced construction. It's not very pleasing on the eye. It looks like a kind of modern housing estate. It's acres and acres and acres of brick. But it is a very sophisticated civilization with flushing toilets, with drains. They really knew how to live. They were every bit as advanced as the Egyptians or the Sumerians. Another site, other Indus Valley sites, Dholavira is in India itself, and Harappa is in northern in Pakistan along the Indus Valley. So here we have this civilization that was flourishing 5,000 years ago in India and was extremely extensive. That traded with Sumer. We know that ships went back and forth between the Indus Valley civilization and Sumer, and that had a script. And here are some of the so-called Indus Valley seals, which were used. They were stamped into clay to reflect ownership. One thing right off that has to be considered is that the Indus Valley script may be totally a commercial language. It may be simply about labeling commercial goods. It's never been deciphered. But what's interesting on some of these seals is that we see figures in known yogic positions. This position is not such a difficult one to do with the feet turned forwards under the body, but this position, where, as you can see, the guy's heels are actually forward and the toes are back underneath his buttocks. Now just imagine doing that. You know, that is a really difficult yogic position. It's called Mula Bandhasana, and you really have to have worked at yoga for a long time to get into that position. Well, what this is telling us is that 5,000 years ago in the Indus Valley civilization, yoga was already incredibly ancient. It was already a fully evolved system, which, with its most advanced postures, already worked out. And we may only guess how much older than 5,000 years ago it was. Obviously, you don't create something like yoga overnight. It's something that takes a long time to develop. And here we see it flourishing in full form in the Indus Valley civilization. And here are examples of the Indus Valley script, which remains undeciphered until this day. And there's a kind of craziness in scholarship, which is related to race, in my view, to racism and to colonialism. The view has, most of us have heard of what is called the Aryan invasion of India. Okay? And what the Aryan invasion of India actually is a fantasy of the colonial era. There never was an Aryan invasion of India. It never, ever happened. But it suited the colonial mindset to imagine that this amazing culture of India had been brought to India by people from Europe. So that's why the Aryan invasion theory was invented. And what scholarship in the last 30 years or so, and particularly in the last couple of decades, has shown is that it's complete nonsense. And that Indian civilization and Indian culture was sui generis in this continent. That's where it emerged. It was not brought in by blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans who Hitler so loved. It was a creation of the Indian subcontinent. And that then raises questions over the most ancient texts of India, which are the Vedic texts, which are the origin of the Hindu religion, which are supposed to have been the work of these Aryan invaders, that they brought the Vedas in with them to India. But now that we know that there were no Aryan invaders, we have to consider the origin of the Vedas. And we have to consider also the date that's put on the Vedas, because the Aryan invasion is supposed to have happened in 1500 BC. Well, nothing much was happening in India in 1500 BC, but 5,000 years ago, 3000 BC, we had this gigantic civilization that we call the Indus Valley civilization. And more scholars are coming to realize that the Vedas really belong to the Indus Valley civilization, and that they were the scriptures of that civilization. So they're not from 1500 BC, they're from 3000 BC or earlier. And they were probably, for a very long period, entirely oral texts. In fact, it's been observed in the 19th and early 20th century, scholars going around talking to Vedic experts in different parts of India would find they were able to recite identical texts from memory without any failure whatsoever, from the deep south of India to the far north. And probably what happened in 1500 BC was that was the first time these texts were written down. Previously they had been oral texts. So we have to consider the mysterious information that is conveyed in the Vedas now, which can no longer be dismissed as simple myth or imagining. The constant references to oceanic travel in the Vedas. Not the work of nomadic people, but the work of seafarers. Detailed knowledge of the sea and descriptions of the ice caps in the Himalayas melting and of huge floods pouring down over the land. It may be that the Vedas were already fantastically old 5,000 years ago. They may go back far, far earlier than that. They may go back right into the last ice age. And of course we have the Indian flood myth, which is the story of Manu, who is rescued from the flood by the fish avatar of the god Vishnu. And Manu and the 7 rishis, the 7 sages, take a huge boat and sail across the waters of the flood, and they are rescued by Vishnu in his avatar as a fish. And they eventually land in the Himalayas, and they re-promulgate civilization from that area. We have to consider what is going on in this story. Are we dealing with the survivors of the lost civilization who settled in the Himalayas and who re-promulgated civilization from there? And perhaps another thing I would ask you to consider is our society is very much focused on technology and on material things. And our scholars tend to look for material explanations for the evolution of civilization. But maybe an earlier civilization was quite different. Maybe it was focused on spiritual values. Maybe it believed in disconnecting from material things. Maybe precisely those yogic ideals, the ideals of the sadhus of India, were central to the civilization that we're looking for. Now, India during the Ice Age, very much more extensive than it is today. And the first place I started looking was up here in Gujarat, where Santha and I first went in 1992 to the city of Dwarka in Gujarat, because there is a specific local flood myth in Dwarka. And that flood myth concerns the god Krishna, and it concerns the beginning of what we call the Kali Yuga, which is the age of strife and darkness that we still live in today. That Kali Yuga was brought on by a flood, and actually if you work with the Indian texts, you can date that to around 3100 BC, which is very close to the date of the beginning of the Mayan calendar, by the way. There is Dwarka today, and there is the story of Krishna. It was the city of Krishna. It was a wonderful city, but eventually the flood came and destroyed it. And it so happens, this is where we started our diving in India, is that underwater off Dwarka are extensive submerged ruins. In other words, the flood myth turns out to be true. And there is no way to date those ruins. There is no datable artifact that has ever been found. They are large stone ruins at the bottom of the sea off Dwarka in Gujarat. And it's a sacred city, rather like Varanasi, and many rituals there are performed in connection with this lost city of Dwarka. Then, if we come in a little further down from Gujarat to the Gulf of Cambay, there was this extraordinary finding in the early 2000s of huge cities at the bottom of the Gulf of Cambay, 40 meters underwater. They'd been submerged for more than 12,000 years. And they were found with side-scan sonar. It's impossible to imagine that that these are natural features. Up to today, they have never been dived on. No submarine has ever been sent down. And the initial dredging work produced many man-made artifacts from those two cities which lie on either side of ancient river courses, but then all the work was stopped, and since about 2002 it's never continued, and I honestly can't tell you why. If we go to South India, we find a huge flood myth of a lost land called Kumari Kandam. And we are told that it was a highly civilized place, and that it was destroyed by the gods in a single terrible day and a night. Guess when? 11,600 years ago. Exactly the same date that is given by Plato for the destruction of Atlantis. And interestingly, if we use the latest science to look at sea levels at that time, we find that southern India was vastly extended into the Indian Ocean. That the Maldives Islands were much larger than they are today. And we do still find pyramids on the Maldives. They're quite small, That's an aerial shot of one of the little pyramids on the Maldives, and that's a pyramid. You can see the wall of the pyramid there in the Maldives itself. In Kanyakumari, at the very southern tip of India, this myth is preserved and elaborated to this day. So there's a huge memory of lost lands to the south of India. And here we find, as it was during the Ice Age, Sri Lanka was joined to South India. This is the feature called Rama's Bridge between Ramaswaram and Sri Lanka. And you can still see huge stone structures in the water there. And we have dived at Pumpar and at Mahabalipuram. And in both places, we have found major underwater structures. We've dived with Indian archaeologists at these sites, and nobody is disputing that these structures are man-made and that they've been underwater for 12,000 plus years. But again, for reasons that mystify me, this is Mahabalipuram, where I did my first ever swimming lessons when I was about 5 years old, and I lived in South India. It was quite strange to end up going back to Mahabalipuram as an adult and scuba diving there. Went there with the scientific, these are the rock-hewn temples of Mahabalipuram on the shore. These are the fishermen who told us about the underwater city, and we made a big expedition there with the Scientific Exploration Society from London, and lo and behold, exactly as the fishermen had told us, there are indeed cities underwater off the coast of Mahabalipuram, and they go for 5 kilometers out from shore. I don't like conspiracy theories, but it really felt like a conspiracy, because after we dived that site, all work was stopped, and nobody was allowed to go back and dive it anymore. And the story was literally brushed under the sea until the Boxing Day tsunami, which exposed the ruins in the bay in front of Mahabalipuram. And nobody could deny anymore that there were ruins there. And now a little bit of archaeology is going on at the site, but it's going on in what's called the intertidal zone, at a depth down to just about 5 meters. They're not going out into the deep water. It's like a deliberate refusal to consider the implications of this site. I'm putting my diving knife in the gap between 2 blocks there. There are very extensive walls, and there clearly was a city there, which is now submerged. And at Tiruvannamalai, inland from there, is this amazing red hill called Arunachala, with a huge temple complex at the base, and a myth there of how in the time of flood, this is where the sages, this is where the rishis go to preserve the knowledge of the Vedas, that it's a place of refuge from the flood. And there's a tremendous place to explore, Tiruvannamalai, and a wonderful climb of the mountain, and it's full of sages and rishis and holy men to this day. In fact, there's one guy up there who's had his arm above his head for the last, 30 years. I don't know how they do that, but he does. Let's jump east from India. There's submerged India, and let's go off and have a look at Indonesia. There are the Indonesian islands today, the Malaysian peninsula, but this was the huge landmass that was above water during the Ice Age, truly a continent-sized landmass. And this is a curiosity. This is, you would think really that this was in Mexico by the look of it. It looks like a Mexican step pyramid. It looks pretty much like Chichen Itza, actually. But it's not. It's a temple in Indonesia, in central Java, and it's called Suku. How do archaeologists explain this? They say it's just a coincidence that these things look similar to one another. I think that we may be looking at a remote common source which has passed down influence in both places, and that influence continues to flower and to express itself. But what I really want to dwell on a bit tonight is the site of Gunung Padang near Bandung in West Java, which is one of the very exciting new archaeological discoveries. And I was privileged, Santa and I went with our friend Robert Schock and his wife Katie. We went there in December at the invitation of Danny Hillman Natwajija, who is the chief geologist working on the site of Gunung Padang. We went to Gunung Padang because something extraordinary has been discovered there. And I was really pleased that Schock was able to come along and bring his geological perspective to bear on the site. Because it's not archaeologists who are doing this work, it's geologists. Danny Hillman is the senior geologist at Indonesia's Geotechnology Center. He got his PhD at Cornell, and he's a remarkable man. And when he started to say that it looks like Gunung Padang ranges between 9,000 and 20,000 years old, not just 2,500 years old, he stirred up a huge shitstorm of archaeological fury. But he stuck to his guns, and he's doing really good science on that site, some of which I'll show you. This is the overall setting of Gunung Padang, and that's the pyramid-shaped hill on which the structures stand. And it's about 100 meters high, that pyramid. It's an entirely artificial man-made pyramid. There's Schock and myself, and that's Danny Hillman on our way up to the top of Gunung Padang. And when you get up there, well, Danny unfurls his scanning results, which are very, very, very extensive. He starts making the point that this stuff is what archaeologists have been dating. This is the surface layer, the very top terraces at the top of the pyramid of Gunung Padang, which are made out of a material called columnar basalt. That's a form of basalt that forms naturally into hexagonal blocks. But it also makes a very useful building material. And there's this very extensive site on the top of what was thought to be a natural hill. And it's that extensive site that has been dated really on no good evidence, just a tiny bit of carbon dating to 2,500 years old. For a long time, that's been the mainstream view, that this site is about 2,500 years old. Did the first extensive survey on the site. And they point out that all the archaeology that has tied that site to 2,500 years ago is just based on a skim of this surface layer. And what they're really interested in is the deep layers of this 100-meter high pyramid, turns out to be entirely man-made, which stands at Gunung Padang. So there is the archaeological trenching. That's as far down as it went. And that was all the information we had until Danny got to work. Even the naked eye will tell you that there's much more. As you go down the sides of that pyramid, you can see that there are stones sticking out of the sides of the hill. And it turns out that, as I say, that the whole upper layers of this are man-made. And Danny and his team used a whole range of remote sensing equipment. They used surface geology, they used archaeology, they used geomagnetic survey, ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, seismic tomography, drill core sampling. They did lab work, metrology, carbon dating, and so on, and also architectural analysis. And here's an example, here's illustrations of Danny and his team at work. Because about 8 months ago, their work was stopped. They were not allowed to continue to do any more work. And the reason they weren't allowed to continue doing any more work was because a cabal of archaeologists in Indonesia said, we know this site is just 2,500 years old, and there's no need for any further work. It's a sacred site, don't interfere with it, leave it alone, all the work has been done. But all the work hasn't been done. And the extensive survey that Danny and his team conducted before they were stopped came up with some really intriguing results. I just want to show you some of the methods of surveying that they used here. And hopefully you will understand that this was very thorough work that these people did. Very extensive work on Gunung. And included in that work was carbon dating, which they did with drill cores. Those drill cores brought up man-made objects, cut stone, and they brought up organic material from the same layers that that cut stone was found in. And drill core 1 started to find material going back 7,000 years or so. The deeper you get, the more ancient it gets. And then 16,000 years. And then when we get to drill core 2, again that top layer at 2,500 years, then 7,880 calibrated years before Christ, 28,310 years old, 21,000 years old, and a nice series of dates from exactly 11,600 years ago, the time of the end of the Younger Dryas, as we go through the various layers of this pyramid. So what Danny and his team are feeling is that we're looking at a monument that has been a monument since the last glacial maximum, and that has been continuously evolved and built up over that whole period. And what a lot of their surveys unite on is that there's a chamber in that monument. Very high resistivity on the remote scans. A large, regular chamber in the heart of the monument. And they're suggesting that it is an artificially altered lava tube. Oddly enough, under the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, you have the same thing. You have a tunnel, which is a lava tunnel, which has been altered by mankind into a regular shape, and you have a chamber. That chamber is the raison d'etre for the construction of the Pyramid of the Sun. It looks like exactly the same thing. The thing is much too regular, according to the remote sensing, to be analysed as a purely natural feature. It's definitely been altered by human beings. And I'll just show a few more slides, all of which concur. There's the suggested entrance to the feature, all of which concur on the existence of a large chamber, an extremely high resistivity zone in the heart of Gunung Padang. And naturally, this is the chamber that they want to excavate. They would like to know what is inside that chamber down in the depths. And it's not the only one. There are two other chambers that have also been found. And the place is crying out for excavation, particularly when we consider the context. There is Indonesia today, and there's how it looked at the last glacial maximum. This was a huge continent, and that Gunung Padang site was built on the very high land at the southern edge of that continent. And that's why it's not underwater, while the rest of the continent is underwater. It was incredibly well watered with huge river systems, all of which were swept away by the floods at the end of the Ice Age, until we end up today with the Indonesian islands as we know them. And all around Gunung Padang are a series of other unexcavated megalithic sites. So the whole area is looking incredibly promising from the point of view of investigating ancient history. Now, as I mentioned, Danny's work was stopped. The archaeologists intervened and prevented it, but Danny found a typically Indonesian way to get around that problem. He doesn't give up. And he took it to the highest level. He took it to the president of Indonesia. And he persuaded the president of Indonesia that this work at Gunung Padang must continue, and that it cannot be allowed to be stopped on the basis of archaeological prejudice. And just 2-3 weeks ago, the president visited Gunung Padang, and he saw all of Danny's research, and he's agreed that the research will resume, and it's going to resume immediately. So within a year from now, we should have a much clearer picture of what is going on at Gunung Padang. And I think it's one of the most exciting archaeological sites in the world. If we consider the broader area, there as it looks today, the Indonesian islands, New Guinea, Australia, there as it looked during the Ice Age, we have to realize that this is a fantastically interesting area which truly was cataclysmically flooded at the end of the last Ice Age. And I'm not trying to draw particular attention to Yap Island in this map. It just happened to be the only convenient map I could find on Google Images. What I actually want to draw attention to is Ponape, this island here in Micronesia, because Santa and I did a lot of diving there a few years back and spent a lot of time on Ponape. And lo and behold, at Ponape, there is a series of structures called Nan Madol, which are made of exactly the same material as we find at Gunung Padang, and which even really look a whole lot like Gunung Padang. These are Gunung Padang on the top, and here is Nan Madol in Micronesia on the bottom. And Nan Madol stands on the edge of the ocean, and if you continue out, again, comparisons between Nan Madol and Gunung Padang. If you continue out into that ocean and get your feet wet and get underwater, you find that the structures continue underwater. And they continue for a long way underwater, down to about 110 feet beneath the sea. And there we find these huge pillars sticking up out of the seabed. In some cases, the pillars are fallen, like this one, and covered in coral growth. And I'm struck by the incredible similarity between that fallen pillar and this huge megalithic piece from the island of Tinian, which is in the same general area up here. In other words, what I'm saying is that this whole area may have a hidden history that we need to explore and consider. I want to spend a few minutes at Borobudur. That's the scale of Gunung Padang and Borobudur. And Borobudur, of course, is a very famous, globally famous monument dating from about 800 AD. But Borobudur, in my view, incorporates much more ancient knowledge and ideas. And it's an amazing and beautiful place to visit. Has anybody here been to Borobudur? Been to Indonesia? No?
Yes.
Yes. There you go. You'll agree then. It's amazing.
To go back.
Yeah. And so this is the view from Puntuk Setumbu at dawn. That is actually Borobudur there. And that's Mount Merapi. It's Merapi, right? Santa lived in Indonesia for years, so she knows a lot more about it than I do. December was my first visit. That's Mount Merapi. And there's Borobudur looking quite small in that misty foreground at dawn. Borobudur again. Let's get closer. Pyramidal structure, as a matter of fact, in a series of square terraces with circular terraces at the top. And a series of stupas at the top of the pyramid. And there are 72 stupas around the central dome. And that number is a really important number when we get to the issue of ancient civilizations. 72 stupas. And in each of those 72 stupas, there's a Buddha statue, some of which are now exposed as a result of vandalism. And in others, they remain inside the stupas. Altogether, there are 504 Buddha statues at Borobudur, of which 432 are on the square terraces and 72 are on the concentric terraces at the top. And this is something I've been going on about for years and years and years. But there appears to be a longitudinal relationship between different monuments around the world, separated by significant numbers of degrees. The number 72 being one of those key figures. There are, for example, 72 degrees of longitude between Angkor in Cambodia and Giza in Egypt. And there are 54 degrees of longitude between Angkor and Ponape, that place where that site, rather like Gunung Padang, exists. If you add 72 to half of 72, in other words, if you add 72 plus 36, you get 108. And if you divide 108 by 2, you get 54. And these are all numbers, as I've explained at great length elsewhere, that are generated by the precession of the equinoxes. There are 72 major temples at Angkor in Cambodia. And there is Angkor Wat, which has a meaning in the Egyptian language, life to the Horus. Oriented precisely north, south, east, and west. And this is the causeway that you stand on at dawn on the spring equinox if you want to see the reason that Angkor Wat was built. The way that the sun rises up the central tower and finally sits on top of the central tower at dawn on the spring equinox. The whole place was built to marry heaven and earth at that exact moment. And back when I wrote Heaven's Mirror, I proposed that the temples of Angkor are laid out on the ground in the form of the constellation of Draco. The positions of the stars in the sky change very slowly as a result of the precession of the equinoxes, which operates at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And you get a perfect match between sky and ground in 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, between Draco and temples of Angkor. So Tiruvannamalai, that hill in southern India, where the survivors of the flood were said to have gone to preserve the Vedas, that is also on the grid, and Giza in Egypt is on the grid, and it's 72 degrees of longitude west of Angkor. And the King's Chamber, of course, is primarily a spiritual place. I have no doubt about that, and it's a spiritually transforming place. And I believe, personally, I can only express my belief that the Great Pyramid is an instrument for transforming human consciousness, and it still works today, even deprived of its context. People are moved by the Great Pyramid, drawn to the Great Pyramid from all over the world, and they don't leave it untouched. But it's also a mathematical place. And you can derive precessional numbers from the King's Chamber. 2,160 is 72 times 30, and these numbers you can take off or add zeros, but basically there's a 3, 4, 5 triangle in the King's Chamber, and when we reduce it to qubits, we find that the number 216 is generated by the dimensions of that 3, 4, 5 triangle. Giza stands at latitude 30 degrees north, 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. And the Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to within 3/60ths of a single degree of true north. This is uncanny accuracy for a monument with a 13-acre footprint. And it's also the reason why I don't think the Great Pyramid was built by aliens. Because if you can navigate here across interstellar space, you can do better than 3/60ths of a single degree. You can get a precisely aligned monument. I think it speaks of human workmanship of a very high order, a much higher order than is attributed to the period of the construction of the pyramids. And again, those numbers, I've talked about this many times, the Great Pyramid is a scale model of the northern hemisphere of the Earth, and if you use those precessional numbers, of which the number 72 is the base, you'll find that if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, which is 600 times 72, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid multiplied by the same number, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. And that's just to remind us of what this precession is. It's the wobble on the Earth's axis. Or perhaps it's the solar system's orbit around another star, which my friend Walter Cruttenden suggests. He suggests very strongly that the observable of precession is not caused by a wobble on the axis of the Earth, but is caused by the fact that we are in orbit around Sirius, in a great sort of cycle in the heavens, which causes this regular change in the positions of the stars in the sky. But whatever causes it, the heartbeat of the system is the number 72. And there are all kinds of cultural artifacts from all around the world which incorporate this sequence of numbers, including, of course, the Mayan calendar, and including myths and traditions from all around the world. So I don't think it's an accident, and we find it, of course, extensively at Borobudur. I don't think it's an accident that key sites like Angkor and Giza are separated by significant numbers of degrees of longitude. And like Angkor, the Great Sphinx marks the equinox. That's what happens at dawn on the spring equinox at the Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx looks exactly at the rising sun. And like Angkor, we have a sky-ground diagram at Giza based on the precession of the equinoxes. You can do it very easily with modern computer software, which Robert Bauval and I summarized in this diagram. Dawn on the spring equinox, 10,500 BC. Orion, the three pyramids, Leonine Monument, the constellation of Leo in the sky, Milky Way, River Nile. The whole thing is much too complicated to be a coincidence. Somebody is using architecture and the stars to draw our attention to an incredibly ancient date in our calendar. And I like to make the point that the Hoover Dam does exactly the same thing, that Oscar Hansen's star map built into the Hoover Dam is there to freeze the skies above the dam at the moment of the dam's completion, so that any, in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. In other words, you don't want to be sending a message 10,000 years into the future in a written language, because nobody may be able to read that language, or the message might not survive. You want to use a universal language, and astronomy and gigantic architecture provide that universal language which any intelligent civilization can decode. However, one could say that Giza is simply a gigantic series of structures designed to commemorate the date of 10,500 BC, were it not for the geology of the Sphinx, and for Robert Schoch's work and John Anthony West's work on the deep erosion, vertical erosion patterns in the wall, the trench around the Sphinx, which speak of the Sphinx being exposed to very, very, very heavy rainfall. And I'm pretty clear now when that rainfall occurred. It occurred at the end of the Younger Dryas, 11,600 years ago. After that 1,000+ year deep freeze, when there was no rain at all, suddenly there were massive, massive rains at the end of the Younger Dryas. And I think that's when the Sphinx and its enclosure got this classic precipitation. Now, of course, the argument at the time amongst Egyptologists was the Sphinx can't possibly be 12,000 years old. There's no other structures, no other large monuments anywhere in the world which are 12,000 years old. Why should we consider that the Sphinx might be 12,000 years old? This is before civilization began. We all know that big monuments belong to the period of established civilized history, not to the period of prehistory, 12,000 years ago. Santha and I tried to draw their attention to some structures that lie off the coast of Alexandria. These structures are not old. The submerged temple of Cleopatra, which we've also dived on, is not ancient. It was submerged as a result of land subsidence off the north coast of Alexandria. And it's not deep. But if you go out into really deep water, and we went with an Egyptian technical diver who used to work with the Egyptian Navy called Ashraf Bisham, and he wrote to me and he said, I have found a site in 110 feet of water off the coast of Alexandria, about 5 kilometers out. It looks man-made to me. Will you come and dive it with us? Well, we did go and dive it with him. It took us more than a week to relocate the site. It was extremely difficult to relocate, but lo and behold, there are these huge megalithic blocks on the seabed, and they have been underwater, we know for sure from the geology, for more than 12,000 years. But that wasn't paid attention to either. This, however, cannot be ignored. And this is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, where Santha and I had a very extensive visit this September, and met and talked with Klaus Schmidt, that's him in silhouette there, from the German Archaeological Institute, who has been excavating Göbekli Tepe for the last decade or so. When I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, nobody knew about Göbekli Tepe. I wish I had known about it, because it is the most amazing, gigantic megalithic site, and it is 12,000 years old. So the argument that the Sphinx couldn't be 12,000 years old because there were no other sites anywhere in the world that were 12,000 years old no longer makes any sense. If you could build Göbekli Tepe, you could make the Sphinx as well. We know it's 12,000 years old because whoever made it deliberately buried it 10,000 years ago. They filled it in with man-made activity, not sedimentation. It was deliberately decommissioned, closed down, and covered with the pot-bellied hill. That's what Göbekli Tepe means, which still covers it to this day. And when Klaus Schmidt went there, an earlier American team had been there, and they had found some beautifully carved bits of megalith sticking above the pot-bellied hill. They looked at that, they said, this is Ottoman work. This was done by the Ottomans. Not old, not bothered. Well, Klaus Schmidt was curious because he'd been on a couple of other sites, very ancient sites in Turkey, and he saw some similarities between those bits and what he had seen. And he went back and started to excavate Göbekli Tepe, and as he dug down, he hit this huge series of stone circles. And very, very extensive, detailed work has been done, and we know for sure that they are 12,000 years old, 11,600 back to 12,000 plus years old. Some of them very large. This one not yet, was never fully excavated from the quarry, the T-shaped pillar, because it had a natural fault in it, but it would have weighed 50 tons had it been erected at Göbekli Tepe. They obviously felt they could erect it. And what Klaus is telling me here, why he's pointing at the ground, is he's letting me know that those stone circles that we see above ground today, they're just a tiny fraction of what remains of Göbekli Tepe. Ground-penetrating radar reveals at least 50 times as much material still under the ground, waiting to be excavated. So like Gunung Padang in Indonesia, we have a sort of time capsule here, which stretches back into that mysterious episode of the Younger Dryas, and allows us, not on the basis of fantasy, but on the basis of hard fact, to consider the possibility of a lost civilization. Because, you know, you don't make something like this. You don't just wake up one day 12,000 years ago and make something like this. You have a background to it. You learn how to do it. You're moving, you're organizing a workforce of hundreds of people. You're moving gigantic blocks of stone. You've got an evolved system of spiritual ideas that are being expressed in this. This doesn't happen overnight. This is the end product of something, and it just appears out of nowhere. Wow, 12,000 years ago in Turkey. Well, what comes to my mind is survivors of a lost civilization could do that. Their cultural base has been destroyed. They go settle in other areas, and they start something again. They re-promulgate civilization. And exactly at that moment in Turkey that Göbekli Tepe is being made, it's exactly when we see the origins of agriculture beginning in Turkey. Agricultural innovation, people start domesticating animals, people start planting barley. We can't be sure. Maybe they just all suddenly got that idea, or maybe the idea was imported to Turkey. I think it was, by the survivors of the lost civilization. And I think that we're going to have to question many other megalithic sites that look very like Göbekli Tepe, but that don't have the uncontaminated carbon dating record, like Manajdra in Malta, virtually identical to Göbekli Tepe. Supposed to be 5,500 years old. I think it might be 12,000 years old too. In the Balearic Islands of Spain, Menorca, T-shaped megaliths, virtually identical to the T-shaped megaliths of Göbekli Tepe. I think we have to reconsider the dates of many megalithic sites around the world. Moving west, this huge island on the Piri Reis map. I'm not going to talk about Antarctica here. I've done that to death over the years, but this is really interesting. Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral. He tells us it's like the Edfu Temple. He tells us he had 100 ancient maps at his disposal. They were all falling apart. He decided to copy them and preserve the information on them on one new map, of which one corner has survived because it was a world map. And off the coast of North America, roughly where the Grand Bahama banks are, we see a huge island. And running up the middle of that island, we see a row of gigantic megaliths. And it turns out that there is a row of gigantic megaliths in that area. It's called the Bimini Road. It's now underwater. That map, I do believe, is preserving ancient information of a civilization that was able to map the Earth during the last ice age. We'll jump east now, west again to Paracas. Paracas, where our friends Fernando and Carla have a house. In Peru, where is the famous candelabra of the Andes. Paracas is on that grid as well. That's the candelabra of the Andes in Paracas. It's an extension of the Nazca lines, as a matter of fact. Precisely sitting on that longitude grid. And let's just fly over a little bit further and take a quick look at the Nazca lines. Santa and I had the enormous privilege of meeting Maria Reiki, the old lady of the lines who preserved and saved the Nazca lines. And I think it was I think it was 1992 that we met her. And she was bedridden at that point and being cared for by her sister, but she spent her life walking these lines. And even there, frail and weak and bedridden, she emphasized to us passionately that in her view these were astronomical figures, that the Nazca lines are not pathways to the mountain gods or anything to do with water. They're all about astronomy. They're about bringing down the constellations to the ground. This curious canine figure from the Nazca lines, hummingbird, the constellation of Orion is depicted by the great spider of Nazca. There are pyramids at Nazca, Cahuachi, been renovated in recent years. And I want to jump north now to the island of the Moon in Lake Titicaca and raise some questions over the antiquity of the monuments that we see there. This was a very important site to the Incas. By the way, the Inca is the name of the king of those people. The Inca was the king. We wrongly call them, in a way, the Incas. They were a Quechua-speaking people of the Andes. The Incas' brides-to-be were kept in this building. And it was a very important building to them, and you can therefore imagine that they would have done their best stonework on that building. They would have tried to do good work. So I would hold this up as an example of good Inca stonework. And that's why I don't believe that Sacsayhuaman was built by the Incas. I just don't believe it for a minute. And I've never believed it. And I made that case strongly in Fingerprints of the Gods back in '95. That what Sacsayhuaman looks like to me is a place that the Incas found. And that they built around and on top of. Same goes for Machu Picchu. Same goes for almost all of the big monuments in the Andes, the gigantic megalithic phase. These rock-hewn, and definitely these rock-hewn structures at Sacsayhuaman as well look nothing like what we know for sure is Inca work. This is, we went there just quite recently. This is a very interesting site called Mapaca. Cut out of solid andesite, this altar up in a cave. But what you're looking at is two different periods of construction. Yes, the Incas were there. They built that. It looks like the stuff they did on the pyramid on the island of the Moon. But they didn't do that and that. They venerated an older site, and you can see it on the streets of Cusco. You can see it very clearly. The people who did this are not the same as the people who did this. Archaeology normally recognizes differences in building styles as really important. But because there's this dogma that everything was done by the Incas, give it all to the Incas. But if you look at the style of building that's done there, it's very, very different. You can see it on this street corner as well as the Coca-Cola age. This huge megalithic, I love the way these kids are just coming around the corner to get their coats. This huge megalithic block on the corner, that is different work from this. And then this again is later work. I think we're looking at a very complicated story there. And that's why I was very privileged to spend several days with Jesus Gamarra in the Andes a few months ago. Because Jesus Gamarra and his father before him, who are themselves descended from the Incas, and who would have an investment in saying everything is made by the Incas, their whole family has been devoted for a century to proving that almost nothing up there was made by the Incas, and that it's all deeply prehistoric megalithic work that was done by an unknown, actually a series of unknown cultures. Jesus actually doesn't believe that this stuff was cut out with chisels or tools at all. He thinks that he doesn't find any tool marks there. And his suggestion is that some ancient science was involved, that they were able to soften the rock, and that these are impressions in the rock, rather than being cut out of the rock in the way that we're used to. And again here, this is very, very interesting. This fell away from here and reveals this stairway, and down at the bottom there is the beginning of a tunnel that supposedly goes all the way down to the Coricancha in the heart of Cusco, closed up now, nobody's allowed in there. And then, of course, there's Tiwanaku. in the Altiplano in Bolivia. And just the truly gigantic blocks of stone there. Again, I think we're looking at a prehistoric site here. Look at this. Make sense of that at 14,000 feet above sea level. Huge blocks of stone. Even the archaeologists don't claim the Incas did this. But I think they're putting far too early a date, far too late a date on Tiwanaku. I'm interested in this symbology. Of course, they didn't see it as the letter H. It looks like a letter H to us. This is from Göbekli Tepe. This H-shaped pattern. And the exact same H motif appears at Tiwanaku in Bolivia as well. And there, I find this very intriguing, the way that the Göbekli Tepe pillars are actually anthropomorphic. They have arms and hands. The hands meet in front of the belly like this. And this is a more elaborate piece of stone carving, also from Turkey, from the city of Urfa, thought to be about 500 years younger than Göbekli Tepe, but again, it's got the same hands, and we find the same kind of hand design at Tiwanaku. I have to say in passing that what he's holding in his hands are not ray guns for they're not ray guns for aliens or from aliens. They're actually snuff trays, and this has been confirmed by Manuel Torres that what the Tiwanaku figures are holding are identical to trays that are found in the ancient Amazon, which were used for DMT snuff. So there's a connection with entheogens here, which I won't go into tonight. I just touch on it there. Cotimbo, also supposedly created by the Incas. Very interesting animal figures of these gigantic megalithic towers. Let's get a bit closer. I'm struck by the comparisons between this figure from Göbekli Tepe and this figure from Cotimbo, and indeed this figure from Nazca. And again, Göbekli Tepe, this leonine figure with the tail curving over the back, rather similar to this. Similar iconography. I don't want to make too much of this. I'm just intrigued by these similarities that crop up all over the world. This figure from Cotimbo in Peru, and this figure from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. This salamander from Cotimbo and a salamander at Göbekli Tepe. Same curving tail, the same way that the legs are done. And here, from the Temple of the Moon above Cuzco, this is a serpent carved into the wall, but it's a very curious looking serpent with a very large head. It looks more like a sperm, actually, or perhaps a newt, some kind of newt. Long tail and a large head. Almost identical serpent is found on one of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. That large sperm-like head and the long tail. Cotimbo in Peru, this figure emerging out of the pillar, and very similar figures from Göbekli Tepe. And a more complex comparison. This is Tiwanaku. Those hands again here. The figure has a serpent. This figure has a serpent on the side, just as we know that the figure from Göbekli Tepe has a serpent on its side. So I finally want to jump over to Easter Island, which in a way is the exception that proves the rule with the grid. No part of Easter Island is exactly on the grid today. But during the Ice Age, when Easter Island was a huge archipelago of land above water, a massive island stood exactly on that precessional grid. And the suggestion I want to make here is that these moai do not belong to the same period as the wall upon which they stand. In fact, it's obvious they don't, because there's an ancient head of one of those moais built into the wall. My suggestion is that the Easter Island moai are much more ancient than we think, and that they were re-erected by a later culture. And again, Professor Robert Schoch at Boston University has done groundbreaking work on this regarding these figures at Ranararaku, where we just see the heads sticking above the quarry. And you might imagine that they don't go very far down. But as Thor Heyerdahl showed back in the 1950s, that's Thor there in the blue safari suit. As he showed back in the 1950s, these figures actually go 30 feet under the ground. And they're huge. And what they're covered by, Robert Schoch's investigations have shown, is natural sedimentation. That sedimentation has built up over a very long period of time. There's just no way that these statues have only been there for 700 years, which is the orthodox view. The sedimentation would have taken thousands and thousands of years to build up. So we have to question. Hands on the pillars of the Göbekli Tepe figures are matched by the hands across the belly on the Easter Island figures. You can see it more clearly in these pictures. Those long fingers meeting above a sort of belt device in the belly, exactly the same as at Göbekli Tepe. What's going on here? And last but not least, those big chins on the Easter Island figures. It's pretty obvious they're beards. Pretty obvious these are bearded figures. And we find bearded figures at Tiwanaku too, and there they are specifically, explicitly associated with Viracocha, the civilizing deity, the Osiris figure of the Andes, with this huge, prominent beard. And up here on the other side of the pillar, above the serpent, there is an unknown animal. We've blown it up here. It looks a lot to me like Toxodon. And Arthur Poznański, who did extensive unorthodox work at Tiwanaku 100 years ago, a bit less, drew attention to other Toxodon imagery there. Toxodon has been extinct for more than 12,000 years. Bearded men in Central America, clearly not Native American Indians. And associated always with the figure of the feathered serpent. Found in the oldest archaeological layers of Mexico. Who are these mysterious strangers that we see in the ancient archaeology of Mexico? They're certainly not Native American Indians. They fit in with legends of civilizers who came to that land after a great cataclysm. And that brings us back to Oannes, the bearded man with the fish on his head from Babylon, and this cute little man bag that he's holding in his hand. And so are these chaps holding little man bags. And a little man bag there, and little man bags here. What are those man bags? Notice the way the hand is positioned. Notice that positioning of the hand. Like that. And compare it with this figure from Central America, who's also holding a man bag. There's not supposed to be any connection between these cultures. I think it's a great mystery here. What are we looking at? Are we looking at the badge of office of some group of sages who went around the world and restored civilization after a time of darkness? Particularly so when the same man bag pretty much appears at Göbekli Tepe, where we know it's 12,000 years old, above complex astronomical diagrams. So, to come back to the stars, it seems to me that a major effort is made all around the world to draw our attention to the period between 12,000 years ago and 13,000 years ago. That is the period that we now know when the Younger Dryas started. And we now know why it started. It started because the Earth was hit by a comet. A comet that had already broken, or at that time broke up into multiple fragments, because those fragments hit many different parts of the Earth. A bit like Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, which hit Jupiter with devastating effect in 1994. And of course, Jupiter is the grand guardian of our planet, sweeping up most comets that would otherwise hit the Earth and sterilize life on Earth. If Shoemaker-Levy 9 had hit the Earth, none of us would be here today. And as a matter of fact, were it not for Jupiter, there would never have been life on Earth. Jupiter is responsible for absorbing most of the comets that would otherwise cross our path. But occasionally, a comet gets through. And since 2007, the science has been advancing on pinning this down. There initially has been some debate about it, but as the studies have gone on, it's become more and more clear what happened. That not only did a comet fragment and hit the Earth 12,980 years ago, not only did it cause the Younger Dryas, setting in motion that short, sharp freeze of 1,000+ years, which it did by sending up huge clouds of dust into the upper atmosphere, which shut off the sun's rays to the Earth for 1,000 years and stopped the Earth warming up. Not only that, but also it's very evident that large fragments of that comet hit the North American ice cap. And they caused it to go into a sudden cataclysmic meltdown. And you can see those meltwater floods across the Pacific Northwest to this day, the results of that. So what you had is a truly cataclysmic event. The Earth is hit by a comet, there's enormous immediate flooding, the atmosphere is filled with dust and vapor, the sun's rays are bounced back into outer space, the Earth radically refreezes, and it goes cold and dry and horrible for 1,300 years, until finally that dust cloud dissipates and the Earth begins to warm up again, and then you get more flooding 11,600 years ago. And the Greenland ice cores are what has tied this down to within 5 years, give or take 5 years, 12,980 years ago. That's when it happened. I think this is the smoking gun. I think this reopens the cold case of the lost civilization. I think we don't have to theorize anymore. We have a specific event at exactly the right moment: the comet impact, the Younger Dryas, and then the meltdown following the Younger Dryas. We can look at various accounts. The Dresden Codex, it's easy to see that it's speaking of that kind of event. In Iran, it isn't this famous Mayan fresco, of course. In Iran, it isn't a flood, it's a freeze that they talk about there. In Aryana Vaeja, the promise to the ancestral paradise of Iran, and how a god warns Yima of a terrible freeze that's coming, and how he must construct underground galleries to preserve mankind so that they can emerge after the freeze is over. I feel confident now that that is speaking of the Younger Dryas. And the accounts in the Vedas of how the 7 rivers were flowing at one time, and then a great dragon seized them and stopped them flowing for more than 1,000 years. That account is given in the Vedas. That is the Younger Dryas. That dragon was the Younger Dryas. And how it was finally smitten and released the rivers, and we enter into the epoch of recorded history. And so there it is again. There's that episode between 12,980 and 11,600 years ago. That punctuation mark in the human story. We've been taught that all our story unfolds in these last 11,600 years. I think before that punctuation mark, there was a grand and brilliant story that we've forgotten. That we are a species with amnesia, and that we are on the verge of recovering our memory. And just a last thought: satellite photographs, the Earth at night. These satellite photographs are used to make a point of how the areas that are doing well economically are brightly lit, and the areas that are not doing so well economically are dark. But you know, if we were hit by a comet now, and our civilization was brought to a radical, thunderous end as it easily could be, because our civilization is very fragile and very interdependent, and none of us actually know much about survival. It's the people who live in the dark areas who carry on. They're the ones who know what to do. And we in the industrialized West would be like headless chickens, completely lost. And that's what I kind of think happened at the end of the last ice age, that it was those dark areas, it was the areas that had been inhabited by hunter-gatherers, where survivors of the lost civilization settled and brought their knowledge and tried to restart civilization and set in motion the long process that culminates in our world today. So there we are. That's it for tonight. Thank you. I suggest, because it's late and we're getting up early and we're going to be on a bus for ages tomorrow, let's do a Q&A session on the bus tomorrow.
Amen.